Stop the world!
Welcome to Stop the World, the ASPI podcast. I'm Olivia Nelson.
And I'm David Rowe.
Dave, we're bringing our listeners another video podcast. So for our listeners that prefer to get their podcast in video form, head over to Spotify or ASPI's YouTube channel. For the rest of our listeners who prefer audio, carry on as you were.
Personally, Liv, I'm an audio-only guy, but our listeners have spoken, as it were, and clearly a lot more of them would like to watch us as well as hear us. So we are doing our best to bring more videos.
Now, Dave, today we have a truly fascinating guest, another Brit. The second in a matter of weeks, and as it happens, they're both former UK national security advisors.
Yep, we had Stephen Lovegrove a few weeks ago. Today it's Lord Mark Sedwill. Mark, as you say, is a very interesting guy. He was previously National Security Advisor and also Cabinet Secretary, which is the head of the civil service in the UK system. It's also a key position advising the Prime Minister, in his case first under Theresa May, who appointed him, and then under Boris Johnson.
He also previously served as UK Ambassador to Afghanistan, the NATO Senior Civilian Representative in Afghanistan, and the head of the Home Office. He's now a member of the UK House of Lords and chair of the think tank International Institute for Strategic Studies.
Good.
That is a mouthful.
Yes, indeed. He was also a diving instructor in his early days after he finished school and went travelling. I was more jealous of that than anything else on his CV, as impressive as it is, because I've always harboured secret desires to be a diving instructor myself. It's one of the many unfulfilled ambitions that I have.
One of many, Dave.
Yes, indeed.
Sedwill is known for setting out a fusion doctrine, which meant ensuring the UK was deploying the full set of its national security, economic and influence capabilities against the full set of its national security, economic and influence goals. So what does that mean?
Yep, we talked about that and how it would look in 2025. But first, we went around the world and discussed all the major global challenges. He's a big picture thinker. He's a great strategic thinker. So we had a big picture discussion that seemed fitting.
A lot of pictures. I can't wait to hear it. Let's hear from Dave and Lord Sedwill.
Welcome to Stop the World. I'm here with Lord Mark Sedwill. Mark, thanks for coming on.
Very good to be with you, David.
I'm going to go around. I'm going to point the viewers and the listeners in the direction of the conversation a little bit, just so they know where we're going. You're known for your national security capability review. I mean, you're known for a lot of things, but that was one thing you did as in your roles as head of the civil service in the UK and national security advisor simultaneously, 2018. It was centred around something called the fusion doctrine, bringing together the various elements of national power, military, economic, diplomatic, social, etc. So I do want to bring the conversation back around to that and talk about how countries like the UK and Australia can structure themselves for the future, including in cooperation with one another. But a lot's happened in the 7 years since he wrote that document, obviously. Yeah. And so I feel like a quick jaunt around the world is useful. First of all, I mean, one of the big trends, obviously, Trump's second term. He's, I suppose, using US national power in his unorthodox way, in an even more pronounced fashion than he did during his first term, to reshape the world, or in some cases, neglect to use it to reshape the world. And you, in your previous roles, dealt with Trump during his first term. What do you see as the obvious opportunities for other democracies who are perhaps a little more wedded to the idea of a traditional liberal international order to try and shape policy, a Trump 2.0 policy, either by minimising the damage that it could do to their interests, or by even perhaps encouraging Trump's unorthodox instincts to try and leverage global solutions of some kind, perhaps to long-standing problems, for instance?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I think what is really striking is just how much better prepared he was, as you would expect in a way, for his second term than he was for his first. He's hit the ground running. We've seen this sort of blizzard, really, of executive orders. Of course, there's a lot of controversy within American politics about the governing style, the unorthodox approach to checks and balances, the judicial system and so on. But internationally, of course, the key issue for allies is the tariff policy, and the thing that most other countries are wrestling with is not necessarily the imposition of tariffs and a new level of tariffs. If those are stable, then trade patterns can adjust and are optimized for them. It's the thing that most governments are wrestling with is just how how changeable that policy is, and the use of tariffs not just for economic purposes but for political purposes. Of course, Australia and the UK have actually managed to secure the baseline tariff of 10% and demonstrate to the Trump administration that actually it is in American interests as well as ours that we stabilize those relationships and that we operate genuinely as allies. Yeah. I think the key to dealing with President Trump is you have to recognize this America first imperative that he has. The policies do vary. He's a very unusual politician, but the key theme is America first. So it's showing that we are willing to be genuine partners that genuinely share the burden in our collective interest, economic interest, security interest, etc. Be completely upfront with him about what we see our national interests are. He expects countries to be willing to talk about their national interest in quite transactional terms. Doesn't mind that isn't necessarily the same as the US, because then, okay, we can make a deal on that basis. But it's being willing to come to the table in that way and show him that what we're proposing, whatever the line is, whatever the issue is, what we're proposing is there's some benefit to his view of what the American national interest is, and actually, as I say, be upfront about it being in the interest of the UK, the interest of Australia, whatever it is as well. And of course, it is just worth keeping in mind, David, that not everything has changed since January the 20th. The really big issues that affect businesses and investors and governments and citizens, climate change, demographic change, technological revolution, those things are much longer term than any particular presidency, and we've got to deal with those as well, because those are going to shape the world over the next 25 years. Yeah.
So I mean, those problems, those international problems you're describing, obviously require global cooperation and global solutions. And the approach that you're describing from individual countries, including I guess fellow democracies, fellow rule-abiding nations, might be great for their own national interests and preserving their national interests in their relationship with the US. But is there some way for us to, I guess, continue? Well, I guess try and keep the US on some sort of course that preserves an element of the role that it's played for the last 75, 80 years that have been, I guess, to my mind, so beneficial to the stability of the world?
Well, I think, again, by showing that it benefits the US.
Right.
You agree or disagree with it. The Trump analysis is that American partners have essentially benefited from the US's security umbrella, the underwriting by the US of the economic system, the trading system, and so on, but the US hasn't benefited from that. And he wants to reset that. Now, you can agree or disagree with that, but that is clearly his worldview. So I think what partners have to do is to show, okay, yeah, we are willing to share the burden. We are willing to address the issues that he cares about, and therefore keep the United States engaged on that basis. So if you look at the recent NATO summit, a lot of concerns that President Trump was going to come into that and essentially tear up a lot of the understandings on which NATO has been based for 80 odd years. And had the Europeans refused to commit to increasing defence investment up to 3.5% of their national income, 5% in total, including resilience and other things, and I think that would have been a real risk, because we saw that during the first presidency. But knowing that he kind of means it, Europeans did commit to that. Skillful NATO Secretary General put that package together, and President Trump reaffirmed American commitment to the alliance, because he saw that the Europeans were willing to share the burden, were willing to do their part. So the answer kind of lies in that, I think. And some of this is about him and his particular worldview, but actually he isn't wrong about the burden sharing. And although he puts it in his own very vivid way, that's just the way he operates. Many Americans who express themselves in more measured terms than he tends to have told us over many years that we simply weren't doing enough. The American taxpayer could no longer essentially subsidize a welfare model they didn't enjoy themselves, et cetera, et cetera. And he just says that out loud in a way that others have said it in more measured or more diplomatic terms. But fundamentally, American allies do have to accept we need to do more in our own and in our collective defence interest in order to maintain US engagement. Because the bigger risk is not the sort of particular sort of Trump style, if you like, quite a unilateral style, quite an unpredictable, unorthodox style, as you've said. The bigger risk lies in isolationism.
Right.
And there is a tendency in American politics which is towards isolationism. It's always been there. It comes and goes. We saw a bit of it over the 12-day war and the involvement in Iran, when there was a bit of a backlash in some of the MAGA movement against the Trump policy of getting engaged. You see that isolationist tendency. That's a bigger risk for allies than actually dealing with a president who is transactional and determined to put American interests first.
Yeah, that's fair. I do hope that Mark Rutte gets the last laugh, having been the butt of cartoonists and satirists over that
He's had a fairly tough time. I don't think he'll be using the daddy word again for a while.
But I hope that his wise handling pays off, as you say.
Well, I think it has. I think it genuinely has. I mean, as you say, we can poke fun at the particular language and so on, but fundamentally, like his predecessor, actually, like Jens Stoltenberg, who did this during the first Trump administration, he has skillfully managed to bring the Europeans together to make the commitments necessary and to hold the alliance together. That's a really important role for the Secretary General.
Agree. No, I think they were have been both fantastic. China, the other superpower, is there still a prospect of a cooperation among democratic partners? This relates to the answers that you've given already, to constrain China's ambitions and tame its behaviour. You know, we've hoped for much of the last 10, 15, 20 years that some combination of deterrence and reassurance can put constraints on China's more, hegemonic ambitions, particularly for the Indo-Pacific. Clearly, AUKUS is alive. No one's going to breathe out until Elbridge Colby's review drops, but it'll probably be okay. The Quad, big interest for Australia, seems pretty shaky right now with the US-India relations going the way they're going. NATO in pretty good shape, as we've talked about, but its focus is understandably Russia first and foremost. The US talks about China as its systemic rival, but Trump does seem prepared to do deals with it. Can rule-abiding states still shape China's behaviour, and if so, how?
So the short answer is yes, and the answer is if we act together. I mean, I could give you a very long version of that, but that is fundamentally it. And actually, we can do that in I think really effective ways. So you talked about a blend of deterrence and reassurance. It is still that blend. There are things on which we have to work with China. We have to work with China on climate change. Right. China is a major economic power. Every country wishes to trade with China. It's obviously an important export market for Australia, but it's an important market for the UK. And actually, it's America's biggest trading partner outside the NAFTA area. So every country is trading with China, and we need China engaged in the world economy. But of course, there are elements of Chinese behaviour we have to push back against, and particularly as they become more assertive in their region. We have the UK Carrier Strike Group with HMS Prince of Wales, which was just in Australia, heading up to Japan over the next couple of weeks. And part of that is to demonstrate a continuing UK commitment to freedom of navigation, maintaining the sea, the open, free trade routes in the Pacific, including the South China Sea, and so on. And Australia's done that in the past, and the United States as well. So all of those things are necessary. We'll do those most effectively if we all essentially take a position in concert. And that doesn't mean being hostile to China. It just means being firm. And being clear about where the red lines are. And if we act in concert, then we can clearly influence Chinese behavior. And we can also induce China to behave as a responsible international player. And I think some of the talk about the US-China rivalry is somewhat overdone. I genuinely don't think we're in a second Cold War, and we're not yet in the sort of Thucydides trap place. Actually, the US and China, of course, are highly competitive and rivalrous, but they are also managing that relationship, both countries actually, with real skill. They've avoided any of the regional conflicts, Ukraine, the Middle East, wars in Africa, where their interests are not aligned, they've avoided any of those bringing them into real tension, let alone confrontation with each other. And they seem determined to ensure that they put a boundary around their competition to ensure that it doesn't get out of hand. They don't miscalculate. It doesn't become confrontational. Of course, there are risks, and one can think of examples where it could trigger a confrontation of that kind, but they seem determined to avoid it, and of course that's in the interests of all of us. Sure. That they do.
Sure. Are the current settings, though, in terms of the degree of coordinated pushback enough, or can you see us needing to step those up?
No, I think we should do a better job of it. I mean, if you think over the past few years, both Australia and Canada, for example, have felt pretty lonely when some of your citizens have in effect been taken hostage in effect by the Chinese system, and you probably felt your allies were a bit too quiet about dealing with that. So I think the only answer, I mean, the United States, of course, can stand on their own 2 feet, but for the rest of us, whether or not we have the direct support on any particular issue of the United States, but if let's say the rest of the G7 plus Australia plus South Korea plus others who are aligned with us. And by the G7, I mean the whole of the EU, not just the countries at the table. If all of those other countries, the next tier of Western-oriented democratic countries, Japan, Australia, the UK, South Korea, France, Germany, etc., take a coherent approach and say, we're all taking this position on whatever it might be, human rights, Hong Kong, the South China Sea, etc., then China has no choice but to respect that. If we take different positions, or if one or other of us finds ourselves in the crosshairs and no one comes to their support, then we will be played off. And when I chaired G7 panel back in 2021, we talked about solidarity among Western nations, and actually that G7 panel included Australia because Australia was at that summit. We talked about exactly that point. How do we act in solidarity? Because by acting in solidarity, it doesn't have to be hostile, doesn't have to be confrontational, but we can then set boundaries that China has to respect.
Okay, good. Closer to home for you, Russia, Europe, UK. How confident are you that the UK and Europe can rise to the challenge of containing and pushing back Russia, keeping the US involved enough for long enough to give the rest of NATO the runway it needs to compose itself and rise to that challenge? How nervous are you as an Englishman right now?
I was more nervous even a few months ago than I am now. I think the NATO summit was an important moment because it wasn't clear that we would achieve exactly that goal that you just set out. But the fact that European NATO committed to this increased investment in defence, and that is real investment in real capability, that there's also a commitment which is less in the headlines than the 3.5%, but which is in many ways equally important, that we're going to integrate that capability and that we're going to integrate our defence industrial base to produce what we need more effectively together. Those elements are really, really important. And in the end, we need to remember that together, even if the United States isn't directly involved, although providing enablers, providing the underlying assurance, but even if they aren't directly involved, together we do outmatch the Russian threat. And of course, we do have in Western Europe 2 nuclear weapons states as well who can provide, we don't have as many, but we can still provide that minimum level of nuclear deterrence against Russia that deters the Russian nuclear threat as well. And both we and the French, we've always done it. Ours is always, the UK's has always been a NATO-oriented deterrent. The French are talking in the same kind of terms about providing that reassurance to allies alongside us and alongside the US. So the simple truth is we had to get our act together in order to be able to provide that common front against the Russian threat. And I think at the NATO summit, job not done yet, but the NATO summit, we took a really important step forward. And I'm confident people understand the nature of the threat. It isn't just Poland and the Baltics who are right up against it, of course, who see it. it is the rest of NATO that understands we need to act in concert in that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the impression that we get from further afield here. I can't resist asking you for a quick prediction. We're roughly 72 hours away as we're recording from the deadline that Trump has set for Putin to come up with a ceasefire deal. I think Saturday, our time, it works out to. I can't say I'm overwhelmingly confident that he'll come up with that he won't take the Mickey. But what do you think Putin might come up with?
I'm not sure he's going to come up with very much.
Yeah.
He's shown no sign of doing so far. So I think he will probably put the Trump administration to the test. Say, okay, you've said there are going to be consequences if I don't. Well, let's see what those are. And I think he'll do that in a way that's more measured than the recent Medvedev language. Who looks, of course, I mean, he's largely talking to a Russian audience, not an international one, in order to shore up his own position. But I don't think we'll see that kind of language from Putin. He's always more measured and sort of colder and more sinister in many ways as a result. But I'd be pretty surprised if the Americans come away with what they're hoping for. And I think Putin will want to say, okay, let's just see how serious this pressure is. And then, of course, the ball is then back in the Washington court. It does to see if they're willing to see it through.
It does feel more serious this time. It
does, and I welcome that.
Yeah, I mean, totally.
After the episode with Zelensky in the Oval Office back at the beginning of the Trump 2 administration, I think we were all really concerned that a deal would be imposed that the rest of us really couldn't get behind. I think that threat that risk has ebbed, and it's partly ebbed because Putin has overplayed it. He's been utterly intransigent. He clearly wants to keep the war going. He's still making demands that are simply untenable for Ukraine itself, for the government in Ukraine, for Western Europe. And we've got to stay solid on those. And the only thing this guy understands is strength. So strength in unity will constrain that threat.
Yep. Hold on to that anger, President Trump. Quickly on the other flashpoint, Middle East. I mean, quickly, he says. I mean, I see it right now, I'm going to bluntly tell you what I think. Israel feels to me like it's throwing away the strategic advantage that it won for itself with its military victories over its regional antagonists, throwing away international support with the starvation in Gaza. I'm interested in your views of how you would characterize it, and to what extent do you think it's going to continue to contribute to broader global risks for the next decade or so?
Yeah, I mean, the situation in Gaza is just utterly appalling and unnecessary. I mean, even if one didn't care about the humanitarian catastrophe there, and there are clearly some who don't, we all must. But it's also against Israel's long-term security interests, because by allowing this to happen and not dealing with it as effectively as they could and should, if you carry out a military campaign, it's the old, what did Colin Powell call it, the Pottery Barn argument. If you break it, you own it. If you carry out a military campaign, you are responsible for the humanitarian consequences of that campaign, whether those consequences are directly from the campaign or because your adversary is behaving badly or whatever. You have to take responsibility for that. And in allowing this to happen, Israel is creating another generation of disaffection and resentment, which will damage their security interest in the long term. So even if you only care about security, and I'm always been a strong supporter of the relationship, the alliance with Israel, the intelligence relationship with Israel, etc. Even if you only care about security and not the immediate humanitarian catastrophe, their action in Gaza is actually damaging their long-term security, and it is frustrating as a friend of Israel to see that. I mean, one has to admire the capability of the action they took against Hezbollah and Iran.
Sure.
Clearly superb intelligence. And what that demonstrates, of course, is that with that, they were able to use precision force in those cases with very little collateral damage, very few civilian casualties, and an effective effort. Then, of course, reinforced by the American those American strikes. And I think we have to acknowledge that the handling of that has been genuinely quite skillful, in that there was clearly a risk it would escalate, but it hasn't. The Iranians have understood the weakness of their position, but also were reassured by the Americans that that action, those strikes were all that they were intending to do. They felt they'd achieved their objectives. And if the Iranians didn't escalate, then it would finish there, the 12-day war, as President Trump christened it. And that has reduced dramatically the Iranian threat to the region, which we were all wrestling with for a really long period. And in a sense, it's the contrast between these two elements of the campaign, which is most tragic and frustrating, because, as you say, there's been a real advance in reducing the Iranian threat on one front, at the same time as seeing this ghastly situation, this humanitarian catastrophe, and actually damage to the security of the region on the other. And we have to stay focused on that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, is for one who is instinctively sympathetic towards Israel, it can be frustrating. All right, let's bring this all around to a fusion doctrine today. Now, I'm going to, at the risk of asking you to do 6 months of work in 3 minutes, if you were doing the same sort of review in 2025, thinking about the next decade or so, I mean, just in broad terms, I mean, what are the sort of major considerations that you'd be taking account?
Well, actually, we've been talking about them.
Yeah.
So when we put that together, one of the policy areas we were wrestling with was the challenge of China. Now, of course, it's evolved in the past several years, but we were dealing with fundamentally exactly the same question. How do we maintain a positive economic relationship? How do we find ways of working with China on global challenges like climate change, whilst also constraining those elements of Chinese behaviour that we can't live with and that we see as and mitigating the security threat. So we were wrestling with exactly that issue, and the whole fusion approach. I mean, essentially, to put it in a nutshell, it was that for a country like the UK, we have security, economic, and wider kind of interests about global influence, and we have capabilities in all those areas as well: security and defence capabilities, economic and development capabilities, diplomatic, influence, communications capabilities. And the central idea was use all of the capabilities in support of all of the objectives.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? It means the national security gang need to care about our economic and trading interests. The economic departments need to recognise they have a responsibility for national security, et cetera, and recognise that if you want to make a system like the UK's, which actually has pretty balanced capabilities, world-class diplomatic service, great intelligence services, effective and actually quite large military, big development budget, etc., that balanced set of capabilities is most effectively applied if we recognise it's fundamentally a team sport. Mm-hmm. And that was the basic insight behind the fusion doctrine. And I think, if anything, it's even more relevant today as we're dealing with these evolving challenges.
To what extent would you bring the private sector into it more? I mean, industry is a really interesting, obviously an interesting component of national power if you are trying to harmonise all of your, all of the elements of your national power. I suppose it's always been the case, but it feels right now as if so much of the innovation is happening in the private sector now. The tech sector and so forth. We see these, I guess, aberrations like, an Australian talking to a Brit here, but to use the US as an example, the reversal of the export restrictions on NVIDIA H20 chips, for instance, clearly due to some effective lobbying from Jensen Huang, doesn't seem to be terribly consistent with the idea of a sort of nationally fused approach, even though Trump in a lot of ways does seem to have this sort of instinctive feel of using national power in a sort of coordinated way. Certainly, using America's economic might more effectively to get the outcomes that he wants is a good example. But there are probably instances in the UK. One that I think of in Australia is we've talked about diversification of our export markets since the pattern of coercion that we faced around the 2020 period.
Yeah.
I don't think it's really quite happened because we've sort of we seem to have forgotten that period or put it behind us. I guess, and this is turning into a waffly question here, but can you just give me your thoughts on how you would bring industry into it in a more forceful sense this time around, and just how easy is that to do in a in a country that still believes in fundamentally open economies? I mean, this fusion idea, I guess it's become a fashionable idea in lots of ways, but whether anyone has ever quite sort of mastered the implementation of it seems to be an outstanding question.
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right. I mean, implementation is tough. Of course, it has become a fashionable idea in some quarters, but the inherent structures of government are still highly siloed. And so building the connective tissue to ensure that on the things we really care about, government is a team sport. And that team does, as you say, include private industry, and in some areas can include even the third sector and wider civil society, is a really tough thing to pull off, because the levers aren't always direct. And I think that's part of the answer to this. So there are clearly areas, and this is probably more acute now in 2025 than it was when we were thinking about this in the run-up to that capability review. One area that there was definitely a feature of our recent national security strategy in the UK and the defence review is national resilience. You've got to think, in the modern economy, in the modern society, critical national infrastructure is not just the core defence establishment that we used to think of it in the Cold War. It involves mobile phone networks, it involves the food retailers, it certainly involves all your power networks and water and other utilities and so on. And most of those are in private hands. So if you're thinking about resilience, contingency planning, resilience against cyber attacks, etc., you've just got to have a conversation with all of those actors. And some of that does involve regulatory tools in order to ensure that everyone whom you're asking to commit resources and so on feels that there isn't a competitive disadvantage in doing so. But some of it is simply engaging them in that national conversation, particularly the bigger players who can have a material effect. If I think of the UK, most of our food security lies in the hands of a handful of very big retailers, Tesco and Sainsbury's and others of that kind, and the same, of course, is true elsewhere in Australia, indeed in the United States. I think when you're looking out in terms of projecting that influence out, it's more indirect. We can't really be in free market economies. Governments don't do this very well anyway. We can't really be telling them where to go and invest and so on. But what we can do is try and create the conditions in which it makes sense for our big investors, our big businesses to do so by pursuing free trade deals and so on. So the UK and Australia made a free trade agreement a priority after Brexit. We've made one with India a priority after Brexit. That sets some guidelines and parameters which the private sector can then follow. Now, it'll be up to them whether they do so. But creating that market access, that does create some of the connective tissue we want on which you can build national security relationships. Right. And of course, the other thing we can do is align some of our investment regimes. So we developed, actually using Australia as a model, the national security investment regime, to try and ensure that we were able to protect our critical areas of our economy and ensure that investment in them didn't create a vulnerability. Right. I think in terms of diversifying export markets, you comment on Australia and many of your natural resources exports still going to China. Of course, you can't direct where the demand is, and at the moment the demand still sits in China, and that's therefore a natural place to sell. China does have a near monopoly in the refining and processing of, in particular, critical raw materials. They haven't done anything nefarious to get that, by the way. They just invested in it. But we are going to have to invest in alternative capabilities of that kind. In my view, Australia would be a very natural place for us all to think about doing that. Canada, one or two other places as well, because otherwise we have created a critical dependency, and we already know that China is willing to turn the dial on some of those refined critical raw materials in order to put on pressure, including, for example, into the United States. There's a piece in the Wall Street Journal reflecting a report recently about just how dependent the US military is on critical raw materials that come from China. Well, we're going to have to diversify those things. And that is going to require some government intervention to enable those industries to build up and not find themselves essentially undercut by China. who are operating to lower labour and environmental standards. But fundamentally, we've got to get the private sector and we've got to get the super funds and others to invest in those areas, and they can only do so if it makes commercial sense. So we've got to make sure it makes commercial sense.
Right, good. Okay, one final one, and another, I'm afraid, sort of fairly broad one. I'm going to splice a couple of ideas together here, but social resilience in advanced democracies right now feels a little bit frayed as well. Obviously, basic things like trust in institutions is low. I'd have to check the stats across all countries, but there are clear indicators that suggest that the quality of life for the first time in the generation that is either at school now or finishing university now is projected to be lower than their parents, and it's the first time in a long time that trend has started to go downwards. If we're going to zero in on one thing, it's a fascination of mine, and that is the impact of artificial intelligence on the job market. I would go so far as to say it's not an unreasonable fear that it is going to disrupt the job market so severely that it could put pressure that it could cause political and social upheaval, sometime in the next decade. How worried are you about that particular issue, and do you have any broader reflections just on how we try to shore up our social resilience as well?
Big question. I think you're right. By the way, as a parent, I like you worry about exactly that question, whether the next generation are going to have the same opportunities, advantages, and the opportunity to. We all as parents want our kids to have a better life than we had. Whatever your start point is, you want your kids to have a better start point than you had, and we all work very hard for that. And you're right to point to the risk that generationally, there's a genuine question there, and part of that is the technological revolution, not just AI, but the other technologies all coming together in one go. And part of it, actually, just over the past 15 years, was the financial crisis and COVID. Those were major shocks to the system. The financial crisis had the effect of damaging societal resilience. I think paradoxically, COVID, if you look at the response to how vaccines were organised and so on, actually probably strengthened some of that societal engagement. If I think of going off and getting a vaccine during the COVID period, you had young students doing all the data entry, you had the medical staff doing the jabs, and you had people from the local business clubs running the car parking and making the whole kind of thing work. So people do, under pressure, come together. We did look after the vulnerable pretty well in most of our communities, and that took a lot of just local people looking after, taking care of people and so on. So I don't think we should be too apocalyptic about it. I think those underlying elements of societal resilience, particularly in stable communities, are there. But you're right to point to the disruption of the technological revolution. And I think one of the things that all governments and indeed citizens have to get our heads around is the sheer scale of change that's all coming together at one time. So we have climate change, we have demographic change, aging populations, increasing longevity, a lot of that very positive, of course, and we have the technological revolution, all coming together in one time. And that's pretty much unprecedented, at least since the first industrial revolution. And of course, the first industrial revolution, we did see major societal disruption coming around that time. And it's to put it in its absolute simplest, the people in the sunset industries, the people in the sunset jobs whose jobs are going to go as a result of technological change will resent that and can be seduced by populist politics, which is always essentially pull up the drawbridge, turn back the clock, blame someone else. And those who benefit in the new jobs, many of which I have no clue what those will be, but there will be new jobs, new areas of activity, as there has been with every other technological change, just get on with their lives and make the best of their lives. And so there's always a risk that the political system is skewed towards those who are protesting the disruption rather than those who benefit from the change. And that's the challenge, I think. If you look back over history, countries who've managed the disruptive effect of a transition through a technological revolution prosper, and businesses prosper, and citizens prosper, and those that don't will genuinely fall off the pace. And that, I think, is the central challenge for modern governments. As I say, it isn't just the technological revolution, it's coming together with the disruptive effects of climate change, both the green transition and indeed climate resilience, aging populations, welcome increasing longevity, but of course the effect of low birth rates and increasing dependency ratios. All of those things coming together in one go are a massive challenge for governments. Some will definitely figure their way through it, and those countries will do really well.
Seize the moment, yes. Mark, we've gone around the world in 40 minutes.
Thank you.
Mark Sedwill, thank you so much
Thanks,
for
David.
talking to me. Cheers.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for on Stop the World this week. We'll be back with another episode next week. Ciao for now.